Well, welcome to this morning's webinar, Age Proof, the New Science of Living a Longer, Healthier and Wealthier Life, with Rose Kenny, who is Regius Professor of Physics, and Professor of Medical Gerontology at Trinity College Dublin. You'll probably know me. I'm Mike Wardle. I'm the Chief Executive here at ZEN. My job today is to chair the session, which means making very short introductions and then getting out of the way so that we can hear from our keynote speaker. The program is very simple. After my introductions, we'll move into the keynote speech, and then there'll be time for Q&A. I just want to give a word of thanks to our sponsors. We're very lucky at the FS Club to have the support, very generous sponsors who enable us to run these webinar series and make sure that we spread knowledge into our network. As I say, the program is quite simple. There will be time for Q&A in the end of the session. If you haven't used the GoToWebinar system before, the way to ask a question or to make an observation is to find the question tab on the dashboard on your screen, type in your question, and when we get to the Q&A session, we'll field those questions and have that discussion. And you can put your question in at any point, so if there's a thought that strikes you, don't lose it. Put it into the question tab so that we pick up your thoughts as we go through. Just by also way of housekeeping, we will be recording today's session, so that if you want to go back and remind yourself of the content, or you have friends and colleagues who will be interested, the recording will be posted on our website and on our YouTube channel in around 24 hours time. So please do make use of that recording if you want to share that far and wide. Finally, if you do ask a question or make a comment today, we will share your contact details with Professor Kenny, so that if there's any need for any follow-up correspondence, that can be made easier. And I think by way of introduction, that's all I need to say, other than introducing, of course, our speaker. Professor Rose Kenny is Regius Professor of Physic and Professor of Medical Gerontology at Trinity College Dublin. She's the founding principal investigator of the Irish Longitudinal Study on Aging and director of Mercer's Institute for Successful Aging, and director of the new WHO Collaboration Centre for Longitudinal Studies in Aging and the Life course. She's received a number of international awards and has published widely, authoring over 600 publications, and should give a strong plug to her book, Age Proof, The New Science of Living a Longer and a Healthier Life. It was shortlisted for the Royal Society's Science Book Prize in 2022 and has now been translated into 12 languages. So we'll post a link to the book at some point during the presentation. Professor Kenny, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today, and very much looking forward to you running us through your thinking about the art and science of aging in a different way. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the lovely introduction, Mike. And I'm delighted to share some of the new science of living a longer and healthier life. And I just want to sort of set the scene, first of all, by reflecting on some of the demographic data with respect to aging, which is quite remarkable, really. Over the last 200 years, we have almost doubled in life expectancy. That means we are living twice as long as somebody in the mid 1800s. And this, of course, has had consequences because fertility rates have dropped globally in the proportion of people over the age of 50, 60, 65, 70, and indeed 80 in particularly Western societies, although the world is catching up. There are three definitions that are worth reflecting on when we talk about living a longer life. The first is lifespan, and that's the maximum number of years an individual can expect to live. Now, we do know that one human has lived to 122 and a half years. So as a species, that is our potential lifespan. That's what we know is the maximum we can expect to live. Life expectancy, however, is the statistic that's used most often and the one you'll hear bandied about in the media most. And that's the average age an individual can expect to live at different stages of life. And that's what's increased hugely. And say you hit 65. Well, as a woman, you can, on average, expect to live another 21 years. And as a man, at the moment in the UK, another 18 and a half years on average. And health span then is really, really the definition that we should be most focused on. That's the number of years someone is healthy without chronic and debilitating disease. And I'll come on to that a little bit later on in the presentation and in terms of ways that we can modify it. But a really important statistic in the context of wealth and finances and how they influence our aging processes are demography and socioeconomic position. And we know that, for example, in the Orkney Islands, and this is last year's NSO data, the healthy lifespan without diseases or disabilities, was 75 years compared to 54 in Blackpool. That's Orkney, that's Blackpool. And they further unpacked this within the ONS data to show that on the top bar here, we have the most deprived 10% of small areas. And just look at this for a moment. So you can expect, say Blackpool, to live on average 52 years in good health, but a further 26 in poor health. And when you compare that with the least deprived 10% of small areas on the lower bar here, you will see that, first of all, life expectancy is a lot longer, but also the period of time in good health is significantly longer and in poorer health significantly less. So a big socioeconomic gradient. Now, why are there different rates of aging? Is it all about our genes? Is it all that people in Blackpool all have, poor genes and the Orkney Islands have good genes? Let's just reflect on that for a moment. We know from identical twin studies where the genes are the same in both, and they're tracked for long periods of time through longitudinal data sets, that at the most, only 30% of lifespan is attributable to genes. And it's usually around 20-25%. That's unless you hit 80, 85, and then your family history really kicks in. And 40 to even 50% of lifespan after that can be explained by genes. But for most of us online, it's 20 to 30%. The rest of the factors biologically that determine the lifespan and the aging process are what we refer to as environmental factors. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about and try and explain a little bit about the underpinning biology of how these environmental factors could possibly determine how long we live for. Now, these 6 men were all around the same age when the photographs were taken. Forget the possible interruption in their appearances through surgical means. But generally speaking, I think it's fair to say they look very, very different. So despite being the same chronological age, that's the number of years, their appearances are different, and actually appearances matter in terms of underpinning biology. So we've two ways that we approach aging. There's chronological age, that's the number you are, the number of candles on a birthday cake, and then biological age, and that's what we're really interested in, because that's going to determine lifespan and life expectancy. And that's what are your cells doing and how old are your cells and what we can do to modify it. And it's the environmental factors that modify that biological aging. So I said identical twin studies have given us a whole lot of information on this. These twins are identical, so the same age, but they look different. This twin looks older, despite being the same chronological age, than this twin. And that's because throughout their lifespan, they have had different exposures. They share the same genes, and for much of their growing up, the same environment growing up, the same age and the same sex. But a whole load of things were different for them. Smoking, job loss, income, marital status, their adversities, occupational hazards, housing quality and diet. And this twin was a smoker on antidepressants, and antidepressants actually can give you an aged appearance, and experienced more socioeconomic deprivation than her twin. And we can actually go right back using blood tests into what's happening at not the gene, but what's the epigene. That's the bit of interaction on the genes that is actually dynamic and does change and does influence energy production in cells, epigenetics. And we can actually see, well, what's different about those twins in terms of their epigenome and therefore biological aging rate, their biological clocks. And on the left here, you've got what their epigenome print looked like aged 3. So yellow is complete agreement in all the epigenetic sites. So you can see they're similar. So all of the sites are agreeing. But here in red and green, it's how much difference there is in their sites now. And you can see that there's huge difference, very little yellow left in their genetic, biological, epigenetic, epigenome behaviors. A lot of variation. And that variation, that change in color, has been driven by these differential exposures during the lifetime of those twins. We can actually measure this. You can send a blood sample off in the morning and see, well, what is my epigenetic age, if you want to know it. And they're fairly accurate. The best one on the market at the moment is this Grim age. And it gives you some sense of your biological aging based on epigenetics, or DNA methylation is another way of referring to epigenetics. Now, we ourselves have done a lot of research in this, and I'll come on to a little bit more of that innovative stuff in a moment. And one of the ways we looked at this was, okay, you've got the epigenetics, and I'll come back to epigenetics, but there are a load of other what we call biomarkers, ways that we can use blood samples or other physiological measures to actually determine what somebody's biological age is and to predict what their course is going to be like. What's the future like for that person? And what we did was we used 13 cohort studies, that's large population studies, and measured 40 biomarkers, or analyzed 40 biomarkers that had been measured in those 13 studies, which represented 12 different physiological systems. By physiological systems, I mean neurological, cardiovascular, endocrine, liver, other metabolic, musculoskeletal, etc. So those are the physiological systems, and we had determined 40 biomarkers which represented those systems. Which of the biomarkers of all of those 40 actually best predicts your health status, your real biological status? And it was cholesterol. These are things we can easily do. Waist-hip ratio, very important. C-reactive protein, an inflammatory marker, simple blood test. Resting heart rate, hugely important. Hemoglobin A1C, a measure of diabetic status. DHEAS is a sort of steroid hormone and related to also gender differences. Peak expiratory flow rate, a measure of lung function. Cystatin C, a kidney, again, commonly used blood test, and heart rate variability. And these aren't expensive epigenetic tests. These are very simple tests that your own general practitioner can do. Indeed, many of them you can do yourself. And even within those, we drilled in further and said, okay, we've got all of those 9, but is there anything, or any of them that, like the top few? And the top few were HDL cholesterol ratio. Blood pressure does matter, but it's so easily treated. Hemoglobin A1C, BMI, your body mass index, waist-hip ratio, and resting heart rate. So if you have to pick 6 top ones that you need to watch every year, they're the 6. Your cholesterol, blood pressure, diabetic status, weight, waist-hip ratio, very important because abdominal fat is a toxic fat, and resting heart rate. So what are the other environmental factors? So they're the biomarkers of aging. So how can we actually modify what we do during the day, during the week, to actually influence those biological metrics and actually dig deep and influence the epigenome? And believe it or not, and the blue zones have originally given us a lot of the markers for these factors. There are a host of, most of them, fun things that we can actually do to make for a better, happier, healthier life. The first of them is relationships. Let's look at relationships. Now, when this was first introduced, the possibility that relationships could make a difference to biological health, it was completely poo-pooed by scientists and the medical profession as a whole. But we now know, and this is a very large meta-analysis of over 300 people, that actually, if you look at well-known environmental factors like obesity, physical inactivity, alcohol, smoking, and these are now social relationships, the quality of your friendships, the quality of your spousal or partner relationship, etc. The frequency you feel loneliness, that the social relationships, having a lack of those, are more potent influencers on physical health, actually on cardiovascular mortality, dying of stroke or heart disease. Your quality of relationships is more potent than smoking, alcohol, physical inactivity, and obesity. That's how important social relationships are. And loneliness and social isolation, we now know biologically trigger inflammation, a chronic inflammation, not acute inflammation, which we need with infections, but a chronic, indolent, inflammatory process in cells, which is toxic to cells and causes accumulation of factors within the cell that it just can't deal with in terms of cleansing cells. And that accumulation eventually leads to death of cells and therefore aging. And when we look at why that would be, that loneliness or social isolation or lack of good social relationships, and I know this is really important to the finance community because I've spoken to cohorts in finance before, and particularly top of the tree, can be very lonely. Biologically, what happens is loneliness actually triggers hormone responses, stress hormone responses, and enhances sympathetic autonomic nervous system responses, which negatively influence glucose pathways and inflammatory pathways. So there's very good biology underpinning now from many, many studies why loneliness and social isolation and poor social relationships influence our biology. That's something we should get right. And this just explains how it influences how our vasculature contracts and inflammation and oxidative stress. I love this story. A friend of mine, a social scientist, went to Sardinia and she was sitting in a 103-year-old man's kitchen interviewing him. 4 generations lived in the house. And his kitchen backed on or fronted on to a little road where people were passing all the time, and the door was always open and they were always coming into the kitchen. She sat down in the morning and watched his day and hardly got a word in edgeways with the man because there was so much activity in the kitchen. The different generations were coming down into the kitchen, chatting to him as they were preparing breakfast or lunch or whatever. And everybody passing was popping in, sitting down, talking. And he said one very funny thing. He was animated and engaged with all of the conversations. And one lady left after a conversation and he turned to my colleague and said, "I can't stand that woman." And she was just amused that he had engaged so actively with her. So what she observed, because she didn't get much chance to talk to him, but what she observed with respect to him and possibly his extended lifespan was the variety in his life and the constant curiosity that he was showing because of all of the engagement. And of course, the rich social engagement. And we know from our own research that this is absolutely the case. We followed people longitudinally, and people who have poor social participation, etc., are much more likely to suffer from depression and have disability. People who are engaged, even engaged with grandchildren and that, have much better social depression, lower depression rates, are much happier and have much less physical disability. Excuse me. And we've measured their bloods and inflammatory markers, and their inflammatory markers are lower. And I show this because your range of social engagement is very varied. So don't forget that it's not just your intimate relationships that matter here in the middle, the yellow marker and the immediate intimate zones, but it's the people you meet in the shop. It's everybody in your work environment. If you have a dog, it's the people you meet in the park walking, etc. It's all of your zones of extended engagement. And there is a lot of work now showing that more and more we're experiencing being a sandwich generation. I don't know if any of you online are experiencing this, but with younger generations, and some responsibility for them, and then an older generation and responsibility for those. And the person in the middle is the sandwich. And there's been lovely work from the UK on a series of 100,000 people followed over 20 years to show that the baby boomers were 1.5 times more likely than previous generations to get cancer and lung disease and heart disease and diabetes and high cholesterol as they entered their 50s and 60s. And an independent contributor to that was the fact that they were caring top and bottom and the stress associated with that caring. A unique set of unshared stresses in which giving of resources and service outweighs receiving them. Getting that balance right is so important. So healthy lifespan isn't keeping up with lifespan. And that seems to be the case globally. So although we're living longer, we're not living longer and more healthy. Why would that be? If we look at the contributors to healthy living, socioeconomic factors, education, job, family, contribute to 40% of healthy lifespan. Physical environment, if you live in a graffitied and dangerous and stressful environment, contributes to 10%. Health behavior, smoking, diet, alcohol, sexual activity to 30%, and health care, the quality and the availability of health care to 20%. So when we're studying why people or how people can have longer healthy lifespan, we have to take all of these factors into consideration to really unpack what's going on. And of course, the solution is good data, early screening, being able to risk stratify people early and manage early indicators of poor health, personalized diagnostics. The Fitbits are helping a lot with this, but getting more granular on that. New models of service delivery, making sure that health services, when necessary, are available. And training and education at many levels, including what we're doing today, but at many strata to raise awareness. And of course, data is the new oil. Having information to drive this, like I've just shared with you. I run a longitudinal study on aging, which actually represents 101 in 156 people over 50 in Ireland. Now we've got 10,500 people in the sample. We've followed them for 16 years, seeing the same people every 2 years, so that we say, okay, for that group, what's the process of aging been like over that 16 years? And it's given us an awful lot of interesting data. We have objective measures through a health assessment that people have for 3.5 hours every 2 years, and then subjective evidence, how they feel that they are aging. And we measure, because of the complexity I've shown you, in all of the factors that contribute to aging, lots of things, genes, nutrition, mental health, but also education, income, marital status, etc., to try and understand the experience of aging, but also then we can influence policymakers, and have done. It's been cited in 190 different policy documents, the study outcome. We could create novel research, and we're developing our own TILDA clocks based on some of the biological measures. And we've also developed it so that we can compare data across data sets, including the English longitudinal study on aging. And when we ask people, what are the two things? When you're 90, what do you want? When you're 90, you want to be able to move around freely, and you want to have your memory. You pretty much are independent and have good quality of life if you can guarantee those two things. And of course, we do loads of walking measures. Walking speed is a really good indicator of your biological aging. And we know that walking speed is hugely varied. And declines. This is age here. As we get older, there's a decline in walking speed. We also know that people who walk slower have older biological age, and that's the grim age clock that I showed you earlier on, compared to people who walk faster. So there's a big difference. Like the effect is 5 centimeters per second difference in walking speed per year of biological excessive aging. So there's a big difference. And we've shown also that social trajectories significantly influence biological aging. So stable low socioeconomic income is associated with almost a 3-year accelerated, biologically 3 years older than those who are stable high, which I suspect is most of this audience. And that ties nicely in with the earlier data that I showed. Hazardous drinking is not good. Smoking is probably the biggest negative effect that we found to date on any of the biological markers we're looking at. Smoking is independently associated with a lot of negativity. And so that's mobility, one of the things that matters, that we can measure that looking at biological clocks. And this is a measure of global cognitive function. And again, the number of errors increase significantly as people get older. We expect that. This is globally, so that's memory and concentration and everything. And we know also that these clocks are associated with that level of cognitive impairment, particularly the grim age, the more recent generation clocks. So we can actually take an observation like your memory is poor or concentration is poor and drill it right down to what's happening at a cellular level. And the interest now, and we have the capacity to do this, I don't have the results, but in 2 years' time I'll have some of the results, is we now have 3 time stamps on these measures, and we're currently analyzing, okay, if you modify your behaviors, like taking physical exercise, does that change your biological measure of cognitive function? And that brings me on to physical exercise and how incredibly important it is. You know, balance, a 30-year-old can stand on one leg for 1 minute. Average 50-year-olds can stand on one leg for 45 seconds. And when you close your eyes, that drops right down to 5 seconds at the most over 50. So balance starts to decline after 30. And balance, of course, poor balance is one of the commonest causes that we fall. Muscle mass also starts to decline after 30. You know this from elite athletes. It's very rarely you'd get a 50-year-old elite athlete who can compete with a 20-year-old elite athlete. But the loss in muscle mass accelerates after 60. So it's terribly important that from 50 on, I would suggest, muscle strengthening exercise programs are employed, as well as aerobic exercise programs. Very important. Only 7% of people in the UK regularly do resistance training. Very low number. So what kind of exercise is best for longer health span? Like for preventing cancer, for example, or lower heart disease or stroke, or lower chest problems. This is lovely, very, very recent data from the BMJ, which actually shows that in terms, these are the different colors represent the different disease states. And the axis here shows muscle strength. That's insufficient activity as the reference point. Muscle strength, aerobic exercise only, people who take aerobic exercise only, and people who take both aerobic exercise and muscle strengthening exercise. And you see here, it's not enough just to do muscle strengthening exercise to prevent cancer, cardiovascular disease, or pulmonary disease. And it's not enough to do aerobic exercise alone, although the performance is better than with muscle strengthening alone. You need both. You need to do both in order to have, at this point in time, the maximum effect on those. And this was a huge US study in nearly 500,000 people followed from 1997 to 2014 so that they could capture all of this information over a longitudinal period of time. Pamela Anderson came out recently and said she wasn't wearing any more makeup and she wasn't, no more wigs, nothing. That's what she looked like when she made the statement, and that's what she looked like when she took off the mask, etc. Very brave to do this in her 50s, lauded by her colleagues in Hollywood, and absolutely lambasted in social media. And I'm showing you this because how you perceive yourself aging matters. Your perception of yourself. What age you feel you are biologically actually influences directly, independently, what's happening in a cell. It's quite remarkable. And we've done a lot of work around this with our psychology team here. If you perceive yourself negatively, if you have a negative attitude towards how you're aging, you say, oh, I feel my age, whatever, independent of whether you've got arthritis or other associated disorders, just it in itself, your perception, actually accelerates brain decline and physical decline. And that's why ageism and media and ageism in your workplace, in the workforce, matters for attitude, matters for perceptions, and matters independently for how you age physically and mentally. And there are lovely experiments on psychology students. So one half of a class was presented with positive stereotypes. Look at this list of very, very positive words: creative, enlightened, guidance, etc. And they had stress markers measured, both blood and autonomic, before, and then they were given a mental stress test, and the stress markers were measured after the stress test. And the other half of the class were given negative stereotypes. And the half of the class who were given positive stereotypes had a much lower stress response to the mathematical tests than the half of the class who were given very negative stereotypes. So at all ages, attitude matters, language matters. It gets in under the skin and makes a difference to our stress responses. It's remarkable. Some of the things you can do to help our biological aging are cold water immersion and showers, even cold water showers in the morning, trigger a biological process called hormesis, which is very beneficial to the system, as is sauna. Sauna, and there's been fantastic recent research on this from Finland, actually activates very, very beneficial heat shock proteins, which prevent aggregation of other toxic proteins, including aggregation of the proteins that we are associated with dementia and possibly causal for dementia, as well as proteins involved in heart disease, in hypertension, narrowing of blood vessels, etc. So these heat shock proteins are good. And lots of recent data has shown sauna benefits dementia, augments physical activity because it's kind of a workout because of the heat. That's the hermetic biological response it induces, prevents stroke, hypertension, pain, clotting, respiratory disease, cardiovascular death, sleep, and mood. It doesn't prevent them altogether, but it significantly influences them in a beneficial way compared to people who don't take regular, frequent saunas. And finally, these are some of the interventions we can employ if you wish, and that there's certainly a lot of talk around, discussion around, and media coverage of. And some of them work, some of them don't. Some of them, the work is still very exploratory and non-conclusive, but they're still out there and lots of people are embarking on them. Certainly calorie restriction makes a difference. And I've shown you how waist-hip ratio and BMI, through really good data sets and longitudinal data, definitely makes a difference to how we function later on, our mobility, our cognitive function, and cardiovascular disease. So caloric restriction matters, but extreme caloric restriction, it may have a negative influence on muscle density. We can come into that into the questions if you want to, and a thing called sarcopenia. Intermittent fasting is good, and there are lots of different methods of that, so worth looking at that. Mediterranean diet comes up trumps all of the time. It's the best by far for microbiome, and there's a lot of work being done in that area at the moment. These nutraceuticals probably work. They work for health and probably for lifespan. Omega-3s, zinc, vitamin C, D, and E. There's still debate around C and E, not D, and not omega. The phytochemicals, which you get in food, particularly plant foods, so that your Mediterranean diet cover that. Physical activity comes up trumps all of the time. Probiotics, prebiotics, and fecal transplant. A lot of research being done. We don't know if probiotics actually modify health status, but we do know they modify the microbiome, and you don't lose anything by taking them. So while we're waiting for more solid randomized controlled trials, we don't lose anything by taking probiotics and prebiotics. Problem is you don't know how much actually active bacteria you're getting in the products that are available at the moment. They're not regulated. And then there are pharmacological interventions. Metformin, still an ongoing trial, but a lot of the recent animal work on this has shown that it doesn't extend lifespan. Rapamycin was very popular. It's now been ditched. It does not extend lifespan in animals, and the ITF studies have shown this very clearly. Sorry, not rapamycin, but I meant to say that everything I've said, that was resveratrol. Rapamycin is the most promising of the drugs. Resveratrol is ditched. Spermidine is also looking positive. And then there are senolytics, which at the moment, most of them are used for cancer as adjuncts with cancer treatment, but cancer and aging process share an awful lot of biology in common. So they're proving very exciting. And statins, the good old statins, actually have an anti-inflammatory effect and are probably the safest bet at the moment in terms of pharmacological interventions. So we've covered an awful lot. There's a whole lot more we can do, but relationships, I would stress, are important. Variety in your life is important. Having a purpose in life matters. And that 103-year-old sitting in the kitchen, he not only had variety, social engagement and curiosity, but he had a purpose every day. And that was part of the curiosity. Attitudes and perceptions matter, and that's something that we should all work on in our working environment, in the workplace. Stress matters. I didn't really go into that much, but stress is hugely important and accelerates the aging process. I showed you the twin and her stressful life, how it influenced her aging biology. Physical activity matters. Keeping weight at a decent level and waist-hip ratio is very important. Introducing creativity gives you purpose, gives you variety, reduces stress, enhances relationships. So think of a creative activity. Diet, we've covered, cold water exposure and sauna. So they're just some of the things that are of benefit. And remember, older age is often portrayed relentlessly negatively, but actually the experience for most is very positive. Most people enter old age and many remain in good health. And a great many more go through older age in health, which is sufficient to have independence and a high quality of life. Most people don't have dementia or major debilitating conditions. And the chances of delaying disease and disability and improving quality of life are increased by these, I think, quite simple and many of them fun measures that we've spoken about, and will be made much easier if it's done with peers as part of a group. So thank you. I'll take questions now. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. We really covered a lot of ground there. If you really want to go in this more deeply, I would recommend Professor Kenny's book. But we've got some questions to start with. First of all, on the blue zones, which you mentioned briefly, those places in the world where people live well into their 90s. And Dan Feeney asked the question, beyond a better diet, what is up with them? Are there other things that we could learn from the experience of people living in those areas?
Okay. Certainly. I mean, they're actually the template from which all of this longitudinal data has evolved in many ways. And everything I've talked about, the social engagement, diet, the blue zones are all on a height. And there's a lot of natural physical activity during the day. Just going shopping, for example, is very often scaled up, and physical activity is actually built into their days. As is social engagement and de-stressing rituals. Most of them share some sort of cultural de-stressing ritual. In Okinawa, there are 5 blue zones, and they're actually in disparate parts of the world, which is very interesting. So Okinawa, an island off the coast of Japan, their de-stressing ritual in the afternoon is sharing green tea with friends and family and reflecting on dead relatives, ancestry. In Sardinia, the older persons particularly meet and have a glass of wine in the afternoon, and that's also found to be a de-stressing ritual. In Loma Linda in California, that's a group of Adventists who have long life, and they pray together in the afternoon. So de-stressing rituals is something that they certainly all share. Being by the sea, and we've done lovely work showing the nearer you are to the sea, particularly having visualizing the sea, the better physical and mood health. And there are lots of reasons for that. And they have good social engagement, etc. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Alison McLeish has asked what impact we think the move to online socializing may have on long life.
Well, that's a great question. I've a bit of a bugbear of mine. We've evolved over millions of years to be tuned into each other's facial expressions, bodily movement, etc. Very, very subtle changes trigger a knowledge base in us and an interaction and a bonding. And social media, you don't get the same at all from social media. And I think that there are benefits in terms of social isolation, of course, with the use of social media, and there's a balance to be struck. But extremes of social media, excessive use of social media is not good. And the other, of course, factor with social media is stress. And there's a whole literature. Cal Newport has written a wonderful book on this. The pinging, the constant expectation of having to respond and not being able to respond, trying to concentrate on something else, is really bad for stress levels. There's lots of work on autonomic dysfunction and stress hormone levels with exposure to that level of social media, if you like, engagement. So I think be cautious around social media.
Thank you very much. We've got quite a few questions coming in, so it's going to be a bit quick fire, I'm afraid. But John Knights has asked about sleep, as indeed has Catherine Holden. The question about deep sleep seems to get less less and less as you get older.
Yeah.
But also, what's the effect of chronic insomnia on the processes we've been talking about?
So the bad news is sleep is very important, and it's a whole talk in itself, which is why I didn't cover it. Look, sleep is terribly important, particularly deep sleep. Yes, deep sleep, which is non-REM sleep, does decline as we get older. We're also inclined to wake up more frequently during the night, so sleep is more fragmented. However, the first thing is not to worry about that. The second thing is to employ as many of the strategies that you can, and there's lots out there about this, to make your room one that you can sleep in, and to employ as much as possible strategies which will ensure you get at least 7, if not 8 hours of sleep a night. Don't be afraid of using a daytime nap. It's a good, healthy thing. Try and take it before 3. Performance actually improves with napping, and it can be 10-minute nap or anything up to probably 45 minutes. Outside those windows, it probably doesn't have a beneficial effect for most. But yeah, sleep is hugely important. But I always say to people, just don't worry about it. That's the first thing. Because if you worry about the fact that you're not sleeping, that compounds the fact that you're not sleeping.
Thank you very much. Just very quickly, Alan George Barton's asked about heart rate variability. Could you say a little bit more about that? And he
Yeah.
also asked me a pointed question: what's a good level for a 70-year-old male?
Oh, so the change. Okay, so heart rate variability is a really good sensitive measure of what our autonomic nervous system is doing. Our autonomic nervous system is probably the most important nervous system in the body. We can stay alive if our with our autonomic nervous system when the rest of our brain is brain dead. And that's what we call vegetative state. So the autonomic nervous system is what's happening autonomically or automatically in the background all of the time. Heart rate variability is really a measure of the dial, the association between sympathetic activity and parasympathetic or vagal activity. What we want, insofar as possible, is to keep vagal activity as high as possible, which is why I showed you in the earlier biomarker study we did, heart rate variability was a really good predictor of functional aging and functional decline with aging, as was resting heart rate, because resting heart rate without drugs, if you're not on drugs, is a very good measure of vagal state. So the lower your resting heart rate and the more variable your heart rate variability, because that says you're getting lots of vagal activity as well as sympathetic activity, the better. The bad news is that heart rate variability declines hugely after the age of probably 50 and certainly goes off a cliff after 70. So all that means is you have to work a lot harder. And physical activity is the best way of actually keeping heart rate variability to a decent level. So yeah, so that's my take on heart rate variability. It does decline with age. There are age-related tables. There are lots of different ways of measuring it. So there's no point in me giving you a metric because it depends on whether you're using time domain or spectral and analytical methods. And the Fitbits, etc., will give you measures of heart rate variability. It's important to say that the nearer your metric is to the chest, the more accurate heart rate variability. Oura rings, if you're thin particularly, or you suffer from a thing called Raynaud's, which nearly 20% of the population do, which is cold hands and feet, they don't give you a good measure then. So the nearer your whatever your tool is for measuring heart rate is to the chest, the better. And all it is the variability in heart rate over a period of time. The shorter the period of time, often the better. In our research study here, we use a 10-minute window of paced and unpaced breathing to measure it. And that's a good, accurate window. Over a 24-hour period, you've got activity, which is going to increase your sympathetic, and then you've resting. So it's not as good for what we're talking about today as just a short window and seeing how you can modify that short window.
Thank you very much indeed. We have run out of time, and we do have some questions that are unanswered. So Tomo Chatterjee has asked, how can you get involved? How can people enroll themselves in longitudinal studies? Shane Drinniam was interested in the relationship between resistance and aerobic training and brain function. And some questions also about whether we are heading in social terms to a more stressful environment, and what we can do as a society to lead to a less stressful environment. But we have, I'm afraid, run out of time. It's just time to say thank you again to our sponsors for supporting these webinars and the series of knowledge events we put on. Brief look forward: on Monday we have a webinar on T+1 from intent to action, and that's about the settlement timescales. Launching the Smart Centres Index 10 on Tuesday next week, and a week after that, a Christmas-themed walk and drinks in London. So do keep an eye on the website and see what's coming up. It just remains for me to thank you, the audience, for your attendance and your engagement, and a big thanks to Professor Rose Kenny for that really interesting tour over the research and where we are in terms of thinking about living a good life well into old age. Thank you so much, Professor Kenny. We look forward to seeing you again at future events. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.